day after Thanksgiving, I called my financial advisor. "Linnea," I said, "I want to start moving things." She didn't ask why. She knew me well enough by then. She just said, "How much?" "All of it." There was a pause on the line, not a long one. Linnea was not the kind of woman who got rattled easily, which is exactly why I'd worked with her for 19 years. "I'll need a few days to pull the paperwork together," she said. "Take whatever you need." I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a while. The coffee pot was still on. Steam curled up from the rim. Outside, the yard was bare. The oak tree my late husband planted the year we moved in had finally dropped its last leaves, and they were piled up against the fence in a way nobody would rake, because nobody came here anymore to rake them. I was 63 years old. I had built something, and I had just watched my son's wife look at me across her dining room table like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. That was the moment I understood it was never going to change. Let me go back a little. My name is Dorothea. Most people call me Dot. I know, it's in that file too. Bear with me. No, actually, nobody calls me anything except Mrs. Fenwick now at the dry cleaning shop where I've worked the counter 3 days a week for the past 11 years. I took that job after my husband Gerald passed, not because I needed the money, because I needed somewhere to be. Gerald had been a quiet man, an engineer. He never talked about money at parties, never drove anything flashy, never took us on the kind of vacations that required a passport. We raised our son Kyle in a 3-bedroom house in Roanoke, Virginia. Gerald packed his lunch every day until the day he retired. I volunteered at the library on Saturdays. We were, to all appearances, ordinary people. What we actually were was careful. Gerald had started buying land in the early 80s. Small parcels, mostly rural, a few outside Charlottesville, one near the coast. Nothing dramatic. He'd spend weeks researching each one. I used to tease him about the legal pads he filled with notes, his reading glasses pushed up on his head. "You're gonna turn us into the richest people nobody's ever heard of," I told him once. He laughed and said that sounded about right. When he died 8 years ago, I sat down with Linnea and looked at everything. The land had appreciated. The investments he'd held through 3 recessions had quietly compounded for decades. There were accounts I'd almost forgotten about. I cried for a long time after that meeting, not because of the money, because I understood, sitting there in Linnea's office with a box of tissues in my lap, that Gerald had spent 40 years making sure I would never have to worry. He'd done it without fanfare, without ever making me feel like I owed him anything for it. He just did it, the way he did everything, steadily and without needing to be thanked. I never told Kyle the full picture, not because I was hiding it from him exactly, more because it never seemed like the right moment, and then more time passed, and then he met Brianna. Brianna came from money, real money, the kind that announces itself. Her father owned a chain of medical supply distributorships across the mid-Atlantic. Her mother sat on the boards of 2 charities and wore the kind of clothes that have no visible labels, because the label is the cut. They were not unkind people, exactly. They were just people who had always been rich, which meant they had a very specific way of measuring the world, and most things either measured up or they didn't. I did not measure up. Kyle brought her home for Christmas the year they got engaged. I made pot roast. Brianna ate 3 bites and spent most of dinner asking Kyle about a restaurant in downtown Roanoke she'd read about. "We should go before we fly back," she said. "I just can't do another night of..." And then she must have remembered I was sitting right there because she stopped and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "This is really homey, Dot. Homey." I said thank you and passed the rolls. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The pot roast was still in the pan. The Christmas lights Gerald and I had strung on the porch years ago blinked on and off in the cold outside the window. I thought about saying something to Kyle. I thought about it for a long time. I didn't. I told myself it would get better, that Brianna was nervous, that she was young, that once they were married and settled, once they were married grandchildren, things would soften, people soften. I had seen it happen. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. They got married in June. It was a beautiful wedding, the kind that Brianna's family did beautifully, an estate venue in the Shenandoah Valley, string lights over a white tent, a band that played until midnight. I wore a pale blue dress I'd bought at a department store in Charlottesville. Brianna's mother wore something that I later found out cost more than my car. I sat at a table near the back with two of Gerald's cousins and a college friend of Kyle's I'd never met. Not the family table. The cousins thought it was odd. I told them the seating was complicated. It wasn't complicated. I just wasn't the right kind of mother. Kyle didn't say anything about it. I think he honestly didn't notice, which was maybe worse. Over the next 4 years, I saw my son at Thanksgiving, sometimes Christmas, and once in the spring when he came through Roanoke for a work trip and stopped by for 2 hours on his way to the airport. Brianna was never with him for the work trips. On holidays, she was there, perfectly pleasant in the way that costs nothing and gives nothing, and her family was usually there too, filling the room with inside jokes and references to places I'd never been and people I'd never met. I learned to make myself small. I sat in the corner with a glass of wine and listened. I asked questions and got polite answers. I watched my son laugh more easily with his father-in-law than he had with me in years. I drove home alone each time. I would sit in the car in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I don't know why. Just to be still, I suppose. This past November, Kyle and Brianna had a dinner for his promotion. He made partner at his firm. I was proud of him, genuinely, deeply proud. I had watched him work for it. I drove up to Richmond, where they'd bought a house 2 years ago, a big colonial in a neighborhood with a homeowners association and streets that curved. Brianna had invited her parents, her sister and brother-in-law, 3 couples from their social circle, and me. I brought Kyle a card and a small wrapped box. Inside the box was a pocket watch that had belonged to Gerald. Gerald had worn it for every important occasion of his adult life: his own promotion, Kyle's birth, our anniversary dinners. The back was engraved with the year they were married. I had cleaned the glass and had the movement serviced. I wrote in the card that Gerald would have been proud, and that I was. We were all standing in their living room when Kyle opened it. He looked at it for a moment. I could see him recognizing it. He looked up at me and started to say something. And then Brianna said from across the room, "Oh, it's an old watch." She said it the way you'd say, "Oh, it's a coupon." Not cruel exactly, just dismissive, the way you dismiss something that doesn't register. She was talking to her sister. They moved on immediately. Kyle put the watch on the side table. He didn't pick it up again for the rest of the evening. Her father gave Kyle a check. I didn't see the amount, but I heard him say, "Just a small start for the Lake House Fund," and everyone laughed like this was an established family reference. I stood there with my glass of wine, and I thought about Gerald packing his lunch every morning for 32 years. I thought about him bent over those legal pads with his reading glasses pushed up, planning for decades he'd never live to see. I thought about what it cost him, not money, but something harder: patience, discipline, love expressed through numbers on a page instead of words in a room. And I thought about his watch sitting on that side table. I said goodnight to Kyle. I said it was a lovely evening. I drove home in the dark. I cried the whole way down 95, which is probably not safe, and I'm not proud of it, but that's the truth. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make my son sound like a villain. Kyle is not a villain. Kyle is a man who fell in love with a woman from a different world and has spent years trying to fit into that world, and somewhere in that effort, he stopped being as careful about what he left behind. That happens. I've watched it happen in other families. I've tried to be honest with myself about how much of it is Brianna and how much of it is just Kyle growing into a version of himself that doesn't have much room for me. But there is a difference between drifting and standing in a room while someone dismisses your dead husband's watch and not saying a word. That part I could not make peace with. I sat at my kitchen table the next morning with my coffee and my phone, and I made a list, not of grievances, of facts. The house Gerald and I owned outright in Roanoke. The 4 parcels of land in Virginia and North Carolina, 2 of which had been under development inquiry for the past year. The investment accounts Linnea managed. The smaller accounts I'd kept separately, mostly municipal bonds Gerald had liked, quiet and reliable. The dry cleaning shop where I worked, which I had purchased from the original owner 6 years ago without telling anyone, including Kyle, because it never came up. I added it all up. Then I called Linnea. She came over on a Monday afternoon with her associate, a young woman named Petra, who was very efficient and did not make small talk. We sat at the dining room table for 4 hours. I told Linnea what I wanted to do. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about her. When I finished, she said, "This is going to take some time to structure properly." I know. Kyle is currently listed as primary beneficiary on 3 of the accounts. Yes. You want to change that? Yes. She looked at me for a moment. She's known me since before Gerald died. She knew him too. Okay, she said. Let's do this right. We spent another 2 hours going through it. Everything I wanted to redirect would go into a trust, not dissolved, not given away, just restructured. The trust would be administered by Linnea's firm. Its terms were specific: charitable distributions to a literacy foundation I'd volunteered with for years, a scholarship fund at the community college in Roanoke where I'd taken some night classes after Gerald passed, and a remainder that could be released to Kyle under certain conditions. Not money conditions, behavior conditions, things like sustained relationship, demonstrated effort, the kind of thing you can't fake over time. I wasn't cutting him out. I was saying, earn it back. There's a difference. About 3 weeks after I met with Linnea, Kyle called me. He didn't call often, so I sat down when I saw his name on the screen. "Mom," he said, "I got a letter from a trust administration firm?" "Yes." A long pause. "What is this?" I told him I'd restructured my estate planning. I told him calmly. I told him it was something I should have done years ago, after his father passed, and I'd simply gotten around to it now. "Mom, this says you have—" He stopped. I could hear him breathing. "Mom, where did this come from?" I told him. Not all of it at once. I told him about the land. I told him about the accounts. I told him about the dry cleaning shop. Another long silence. "I didn't know," he finally said. "No," I agreed. "You didn't. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about all the Christmases and the corner chairs and the pot roast with 3 bites taken out of it. I thought about his father's watch on the side table. "I don't think it would have changed how you treated me," I said. "I think it might have changed how Brianna did. And I didn't want that kind of attention. I wanted to know whether my son would show up for me when he thought I had nothing to offer him." Silence. "Kyle," I said, "I love you. I have always loved you. But for the last 5 years, you have let your wife treat me like I was an inconvenience, and you have said nothing, not once, not a word. That is what I cannot get past. Not the missed calls, not the dinners. That moment, specifically. Your father's watch." He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said. His voice was different. Smaller, somehow, than it had been at the start of the call. "I know I did that. I'm not asking you to leave your wife," I said. "I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to choose. I'm asking you to be my son. Not when it's easy. Not when I might be worth something to you. My son." He said he needed some time. I told him to take it. "I'm not going to tell you there was a grand reconciliation. Life is not a television movie. Kyle and I have spoken 4 times since that phone call. The conversations have been careful and a little awkward, and nothing like they were when he was young and would call me just to talk about nothing in particular. But they're real. They're more real than anything we've had in years." He came to Roanoke in February. Alone, he sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee, and we talked for 3 hours. He told me things about his marriage I didn't ask to know. I told him things about his father he'd never heard. At one point, he picked up an old photo from the windowsill. Gerald and me on our 25th anniversary, standing in front of a little inn in the Blue Ridge, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Before he left, he went to the shelf in the living room where I'd put the pocket watch after Thanksgiving. He picked it up. He looked at the engraving on the back. He put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't ask if he could take it. He didn't ask if he could take it. He didn't need to. It was his. It had always been his. I'd kept it for him until he was ready for it. Brianna and I are not friends. I don't expect that to change. She is who she is, and I have made peace with that. What I have not made peace with, and will not, is my son standing quietly while someone made me feel small. That is what the trust is about. Not punishment, a requirement. The conditions aren't impossible. They're just real. Show up, be present, treat me like I belong in your life. Over time, not in a single phone call, not in a gesture. Over time, consistently, the way your father showed love, quietly, steadily, without needing a witness, that's all. I still work at the dry cleaning shop 3 days a week. I still drive the same car I've had for 8 years. I still eat dinner alone most nights, and I still sit in the car in my driveway sometimes before I go inside, just to be still. I don't need anyone to know what I have. I never did. Gerald taught me that. He spent 40 years building something in the background of an ordinary life, and he did it because he loved me, not because he wanted anyone to know he'd done it. I think about him a lot these days. I think about the way he used to sit at the kitchen table with his legal pads and his reading glasses and his patience that seemed to have no bottom. I hope I got that from him. The patience. I hope Kyle got it too. He's going to need it. The trust has conditions, and conditions take time, but the door is open. It has always been open. I left it open on purpose because that's what you do when you love someone. You don't slam the door. You just stop standing there holding it open by yourself. You put the watch on the shelf and you wait for them to be ready to pick it up. I've thought a lot about why I didn't speak up sooner. Not just at that dinner. Not just that one night when Gerald's watch sat untouched on Brianna's side table while everyone laughed about lake houses, but all the years before it. All the Christmases I spent in the corner chair. All the drives home alone. I think I stayed quiet because I confused silence with grace. I told myself I was being the bigger person, patient, unbothered. But there's a difference between choosing peace and simply being afraid of what happens if you ask to be treated like you matter. I wasn't graceful. I was just afraid. Afraid my son would choose her over me if I forced the moment. Afraid that speaking the truth out loud would make it more real than I could bear. What I've learned, slowly, at 63, which is maybe later than I should have, is that the things we refuse to name don't disappear. They just calcify. They harden into the shape of every dinner you sat through with a polite smile, every phone call you didn't make because you didn't want to be a burden, every time you drove home in the dark and told yourself it was fine. It is not fine. And the longer you pretend it is, the more you teach the people around you that it's acceptable to treat you that way. That's not about blame. That's just cause and effect. Kyle didn't become the man who put his father's watch on a side table overnight. He became that man through 5 years of small moments where nobody, including me, required anything different from him. That's on Brianna, yes, but it's also on me. I handed him the watch and said nothing when he set it down. That silence was a choice too. Tracing things back to their root is not about punishment. It's about honesty. When I finally restructured everything, I wasn't trying to hurt Kyle. I was trying to stop a pattern that I had helped create by never interrupting it. The trust conditions aren't cruel. They're just real. Show up. Consistently. Over time. Be my son. Not because there's something in it for you, but because I am your mother and I loved you before you had anything to offer me. That's the only thing I've ever wanted. And it took me far too long to say it clearly. Gerald spent 40 years building something in the background of an ordinary life, and he did it because he believed that quiet, steady effort was its own kind of integrity. He never needed anyone to see it. Neither do I. But I think about what he would say if he'd been in that room and watched his watch get set aside like a piece of clutter. I think he would have been sad. Not angry, just sad. And that matters to me more than anything else in this story. Kyle has his father's watch now. He put it in his jacket pocket and took it home, and that small gesture cost him something. Not money, something harder. I know what it cost him because I watched his face. That's where I'm putting my hope. Not in accounts or paperwork or legal terms, in the fact that he reached for it and he knew exactly what he was holding. The door's open. It has always been open.